Welcome back to another episode of the Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I am so excited for this interview, you guys. Oh my goodness. I'm joined by Dr. Miletic. He is incredible. We have never actually met in person. However, I've only heard him so highly recommended by my great friend, Victoria Felkar. She's been on the show before. It's been a while, but if you guys listen to her previously or have listened to other podcasts she's been on, she highly recommended him just in general. And you guys do work together. And we got linked up, and I am just so excited for this talk on really all things trauma and how this stems, what problems this creates for clients. What does trauma mean? What does it look like? And how do we work past this? So first of all, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's totally my pleasure, Lauren.
And give everybody a little bit of background on you. I know you have an incredible background and expertise. So just let's dive into that really quickly first, and then we'll get into it.
Well, like a lot of people, I suppose I can't separate the personal from the professional. So, from a personal point of view, yeah, I lived a life where there was a lot of childhood trauma growing up, and a lot of different things that I had to navigate and find ways to negotiate through and wind my way through, and have learned a lot of great life lessons along the way from that. But that sort of led me in the direction of medicine. And actually, very, very young, at a really young age, I realized just the impact of stress and how it actually impacts how it actually impacts itself on our physical manifestations and actually disease formation and progress. So that was something that was intuitive, super early on, wanted to go into medical school. At the same time, though, I was deeply involved in athletics and sports, and then got involved in Olympic weightlifting at about 14 or 15, and that became my prime sport. So fortunately, I could kind of use my training sessions in a way that I didn't have to take away from studies too much, and be able to train at the same time. So from there, I was on the Olympic weightlifting team in Canadian Olympic weightlifting team, 1984. But coincident with that, again, you'll see these parallels. I started to read a lot about Hans Selye, who was one of the top researchers on stress and how it affects our physiology, how it affects our performance, how it affects all the different aspects of who we are as individuals, our identity even. So as I was training, I was actually reading Hans Selye. So from there, after the games were completed, my focus had been athletics at that point. Obviously, medicine, I didn't even know where I was going to go or how I was going to do it, but ended up doing a number of different specialties. And that included small town family practice, where we did everything. And we were doing from minor surgical procedures to deliveries to emergency room to running a small ICU. I mean, literally everything.
And this was still in Canada, correct?
Yeah, that was still in Canada. And what I found too, back to the theme, was that there were so many people that were coming for a primary care perspective, or for fertility perspectives from women, from autoimmune diseases to even, frankly, heart disease and cancer and so on, that had massive sources of stress going on in their lives. So that got me super interested in, kind of moving more into that. Did a psychiatry residency in the US, but that became, here the psychiatry residencies are almost all medical model, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, where you come in and you get, do you meet the criteria for these different things? And if you do, you get a medication and see you. So did learn a lot about the medical model and about neurology at the time, but that wasn't enough. And then I went and on my own independently, got all kinds of psychotherapy work outside of the residency, work meaning training, got into my own therapy early on, and then trained and got a certification in psychoanalysis. Never practiced psychoanalysis per se, but the training in child development and the impact of trauma and so forth. Questions that aren't even addressed by psychiatrists. So I really got interested in that and how that sort of formed a narrative in the course of developing whatever the mental health issue was, and whatever the physical health problems could be. And then finally, I guess, to dot the I's and cross the T's on that, went back and did another residency in metabolic medicine. So I've been able to tie in sort of brain and body and all things physiologic with all things neurologic and psychological. So here we are.
Amazing. And you have such a unique perspective, not only being a high level athlete yourself, someone who has dealt with traumatic issues yourself, worked through them, and then, of course, have all the, schooling and the expertise. And it is so interesting still, in my opinion, that the mind and body is so separated in school, and obviously I understand we have to have specialties, right? Like if you are a surgeon, you need to be specialized in that, right? Like I'm not saying that everything needs to be like this whole cohesive, unit, but I feel like at least the fundamental training, should be more integrated in my opinion, because I feel like that would only make better practitioners. And I would be interested to see just with this surgence, or I guess resurgence or surgence of how people are looking at the mind and body again,
Yeah.
how that might change, medical schools moving forward, maybe not tomorrow, but in 20 years, is it going to look different because of how our understanding is changing? I don't know. I'm just very, very intrigued, like big picture, how that's going to move, because I feel like that would make much more sense from like a baseline perspective and then specializing from there.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly, obviously, with
Yeah.
you, and where things have gone, because the medicalization of everything has its obviously tremendous pluses, breakthroughs in cancer, breakthroughs in disease, and so forth. But unfortunately, that requires, and surgery, as you mentioned too, but that requires looking through your own drinking straw, getting as to be as great a cardiac or brain surgeon or whatever kind of surgeon you are, and then saying, okay, see you, but then not realizing everything else that led up to why you're on the operating table, and then what you can do to help the healing process
Mhm.
afterwards. So I think that the medical system is finally starting to change at the level of medical schools. I haven't seen that going into the residency so much, although there are a few isolated ones in the country that are starting to change and look more at it from your perspective that you're mentioning. But still, 99% of psychiatrists and close to 100% of, I know you've got a largely female audience, but gynecologists, I'd challenge how many gynecologists out there are actually asking about, okay, what are the stressors in your life? Even fertility people that should be asking fundamental questions. What are the stressors? What's the state of your marriage? What kind of childhood experiences have you had that may have been traumatic or not traumatic? What's your history? No one's asking that. And so they're not
No.
really putting into practice yet those principles that are so critical.
It really is. When you take a step back, it is so crazy to think like we are not even asking these questions, and especially in terms of the fertility stuff. And, I, like you mentioned, I do primarily work with female clients, and female clients who many of them have fertility issues because, it's a pretty common thing at this point. And, that's not even in the discussion. And like, thankfully, they are working, with me or someone on our team. And we have, okay, healthy practices and habits and trying to focus on quality foods and movement and all that, but that's not even really part of the discussion. The discussion is, hey, don't train strenuously right now and probably don't drink alcohol. Like that's it, like that's the recommendations, and it's really just. And again, I'm not faulting everybody. I get it, like especially in terms of like psychiatry, like you have a short amount of time with people. And obviously most people are going there and they're assuming that they're going to be on some kind of medication, but it's just, there's so many things that we could try to fix, right? But all we can focus on is what can we do in our practices. And so let's get into trauma. And again, we hear this word all the time. I would say that there's been a big shift in the world of just mental health in general, right? But what is trauma in your definition? Because I feel like people hear this and they're not really sure how to conceptualize it. So before we dive into it, I want to really just kind of put a framework around trauma through your lens and your discussions.
Yeah, I think that starting with the framework is really critical, Lauren, because trauma obviously becomes an overused word once it's in social media, and and then you hear the word triggered, and then that becomes sort of even more of a hot button for everybody, even to have even to have a conversation, oh, I'm triggered by this or that.
Mhm.
No, not necessarily. Your trauma is not being triggered necessarily. You are just being activated by something, and that's an emotion. So
And that's
it's
normal.
yeah, that's very normal, yes. And so whenever we overuse something from let's look at one end of the spectrum first. Whenever we overuse something, it can become almost an excuse. It can become a place to hide in and of itself. And unfortunately, I'm seeing too much of that happening on the internet now, where people are, becoming these trauma experts and are using these catchphrases and these buzzwords and so forth. But really, what that's doing to people is, in a sense, you're creating a self-victimhood in yourself. And because you're seeing yourself as a traumatized person or a triggered person, and in reality, you're taking away your agency to do something about the particular thing that's going on. You're giving up your ability to be stronger in the world because you've got a label for yourself. So you end up self-labeling in a certain way. But when we really look at what trauma is, and back to your other question, I think we can get much more specific about it. So, the psychiatrists and the DSM people and the psychologists, they always connect it with pretty much a life-threatening event, and then it has to meet certain criteria, right? But much more useful is when we think about trauma is looking at something that was developed at Harvard called the ACE score, Adverse Childhood Experiences Score. So what we're finding with that is the number of adverse childhood experiences, the greater the number of those, the greater the number of or the greater the possibility of physical ailments developing later in life, the shorter the lifespan, the greater the degree of sort of mental health issues as we go along, the greater the substance abuse, the greater the suicide risk. So there's a very positive correlation in that ACE score with all of these things that can become ultimately deadly. So that's from an epidemiologic standpoint. Now, what are we talking about psychologically and then physiologically? Well, trauma is something that happens to an individual in which their emotions become completely overwhelming. So I use the phrase too muchness. It's a state of too muchness where their brain cannot handle it. And then the other important piece is there's no one there for them. Since we're talking about kids to start with, there's no one there to explain the world to them, to explain what happened, what's happening, what they're feeling, to give them some sense of being able to think through it. So their nervous system becomes overwhelmed, and they literally develop a wound that stays in place. And we can talk about, you go into the weeds about the neuroscience of how that happens, but you're literally forming tracks and connections within the brain that I'm calling a wound, but are really neurological pathways that are holding on to the trauma. And then like people like Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate and people like that are talking about that, all because our brains are connected with our nervous system, all of that can get stored in our bodies. So a sense of being overwhelmed by something in which we're all alone in it. It's a sense of too muchness, an emotional flooding, and it's going to leave a permanent and long lasting impact. And then there's a need to either stay away from that, so there's an avoidance component, or else some kind of adaptation if that thing gets repeated over time, so that our personalities and identities actually form around the nidus of that trauma.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that would be my working definition. It's a little lengthy.
I mean, I didn't expect anything less if we're being honest. So I feel like there's no real if you have a really concise answer to that, I would have been more concerned. Then I would have been like, all right, this is kind of that Instagram psychology. I call it the pop psychology. If you guys listen to the podcast, me and Rick refer to it as that. And it is so it's so frustrating how I feel, and that is just the world that we live in now with the way that information is transmitted, that people like to take these little bites or this piece of information, and they share it in this way that, in my opinion, and I'm sure you agree, is like more harmful. You know what I mean? Because now, like you said, you're self-labeling, and you're not saying anymore that, like, I have anxiety Like you're saying, like, I am anxiety, you know what I mean? Like I am my diagnosis, or not even maybe it's a formal diagnosis. Like I am what I read here, and oh my gosh, I line up with all these symptoms. And maybe you do, but it's like I go back and forth on, is that even helpful for a lot of people, right? Like to have that label, so to speak, or are those labels even maybe creating that narrative for them and keeping them almost trapped in there. And that's where I feel like social media can, and just short bites of information in this realm that is so nuanced and so detailed and so specific, can be really harmful. Like I understand bringing awareness to things, and I'm all about, like, we can't all digest 10-hour podcasts and read 15 books. Like I get that, but it's like, I don't know, I feel like there has to be something that changes, because I feel like it's creating more harm than good. Would you agree with that?
Well, I want to grab one of the things you said because in my opinion, it's really, really right on and brilliant for that matter. Because when things happen and when we develop certain feelings about ourselves, those feelings we can take on as reality. In
Mhm.
other words, someone that might be afraid and have let's just go back to childhood again. Let's say they've had repeated experiences that have been frightening. I don't know, just pick an example. Conflict in the home that they've grown up with. I'm just thinking about a patient I just had this week where there's constant fighting going on between parents. The kids would be in the upstairs, but hearing this every single night. So they'd be afraid to come down in the morning. And that translated into, well, I'm afraid to go to school. And then what did they get labeled as by the parents? Oh, don't be such initially a scaredy cat. Don't be so afraid. Don't be so this. So the person ends up labeling and identifying themselves. They take that, oh, I must be a frightened person.
Mhm.
And then they go to the next step is, well, that's part of who I am. And so you hear this all the time, right? That's just who I am. Well, no, it really isn't. It's just what you've created because of the work in the environment and the messaging you got from parents. Fast forward a few years, and they go on and they start going on Instagram and Twitter and places like that, and even psychology for that matter, when they start saying, well, you're an I don't know, an empath, or you're a this or you're a that. Well, no, that may be a part of how you feel about yourself, but that doesn't need to define you as a person.
Mhm.
As a person, whenever you label something, you demean and diminish the complexity of that human being.
Absolutely. And I've had to work really hard to catch myself. Like I used to say those things like about myself. Oh, I'm just this way, and it's like, maybe that's true right now, right? And sometimes like being a certain way is a good thing, right? Like it's a positive adaptation. However, there can also be those negative things, and you are keeping yourself in that. And that's where, a lot of and I love a good personality test. I love a test. I love learning stuff. Oh, how does this fit in? Because again, it's creating this lens of how you can view things. But it's so like you can't get attached to that. You can't be like, I am this, plant my stake, and everything goes around that. And I'm like, I generally do not like confrontation, which I'm a very vocal person. I'm pretty loud. People wouldn't think that, but there are certain situations that I very much shut down, right? But if
Mm.
I continuously say to myself, oh, you don't like confrontation, you're not good at this, you can't stand up, you can't, I'm only further creating that narrative for myself to stay in that place. But that takes a lot of work to rewire, especially like to your point, if all of this has started early. And there's not, sometimes for traumatic events, I think people can say like, this day this started happening, right? But then there's a lot of times where you don't, right? Like, do you see that where it's like, I don't really know when or why this happened, but that's just kind of how things transpired. And then now here we are, right? So it's one of those things that it's like you have to really say like, okay, if I've been acting this certain way or living through this certain lens for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, okay, this is going to take a lot of rewiring for me. But me continuously saying these thoughts, or I'm keeping myself in this place. um but would you say, so I know that we touched on this, we talked before the podcast, and what are some of the ways that you see this manifesting physically? Because I'm so glad that we talked about this because I've seen this in my practice. I've talked to Victoria about this, and now I'm hearing you talk about this. And it's something that I've noticed over time working with clients how a lot of issues manifest physically, right?
Mhm.
Um, but they are this, the underlying issue is maybe more trauma based or psychological based or stressor based, but it's manifesting physically. So what are some of the ways that you see that in your practice? Because I think that that is there again, this is one of those mind body disconnects because people are just being, oh, you have digestive issues. Okay, let's just look at this. And I'm like, yes, there are obviously people who have digestive issues, but a lot of people that I've worked with, after we, fix a few things here and there with their diet, we still also need to fix all this other mental work, because that really seems to be the root. So what do you see in your practice?
Well, let's just start with your example, Lauren. I
Mhm.
mean, that's such a common thing, right? I mean, it's impossible to meet somebody that doesn't have a digestive issue of some sort right now
Yeah.
or has had one in the past.
Yeah.
So, and I think you're identifying something really important here because even the GI physicians, as well as coaching and so forth, what do we look at? We look at probiotics, we look at prebiotics, we look at diet, we look at timing of food, we look at the kind of food, we look at all of those things.
Mhm.
Well, all of these things that we're talking about back to your question about how does trauma convert into something physical, there's a cellular and physiologic basis for all of this that's the literature is full of. Okay, so back to the GI system. The GI system is basically an entire specialized tube that, like we were talking about with Florida, changes in its function from
Listen, anybody who hasn't visited Florida, every hour you drive in any direction is a completely different vibe, a completely different type of person. So we got everything here.
No, Lauren, I'm going to say this is only because of your creativity, but I'm now linking the GI system to Florida.
I'm so
So,
glad. Please cite me in your next presentation.
yeah. So thank you for that today. So when we start off in the mouth and in the pharynx, right, we have a particular kind of tube. The tube is specialized, secretes saliva. It's meant to move food along and move food along into the esophagus, and in the esophagus has different cells in it. The esophagus works by peristalsis, moving food into the stomach, and we can go all the way out to a bowel movement with that, whereby each point along the way, the architecture and the musculature and so forth of that GI system changes. And what people look at is the interior of that. They look at the inside of that. They look at what's going on in, is there a leaky gut? Is there a problem with the microbiome? Is there a problem with fiber? And so on and so forth. But what's not properly understood, and this goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the entire sort of overall physiology, is that that tube is completely enveloped and surrounded by nerves and by blood vessels. So all the food needs to be moved along from top to bottom, but what's responsible for that are the nerves and the nervous system that connects that. So in other words, if we're feeling stressed and autonomically upregulated, by definition, we're not going to be able to move food very quickly. First of all, swallowing can become difficult. We're going to feel full. We're going to feel bloated. We're going to have reflux. So that's our nervous system impacting the functioning of that muscle. It's nothing to do with what's inside, everything to do with the nervous system at that point. Following it along the line, though, again, if upregulation of that is actually going to cause an increase in peristalsis in the large intestine. So what happens? People get diarrhea, people get cramps, people have urgency, people have these alternating constipation diarrhea. Okay, we call it IBS, and then we give medications and change the diet, but it's not really a dietary problem. Although there's a contribution to it, it's not causal. It's caused from our nervous system and the way the nervous system is wrapping around this tube and signaling back and forth. So that's the easiest place to look at. And when we look at brain body sorts of functioning, What gets super interesting along the way, though, is long-term disease. So we're talking about a functional problem that can be fixed and that can be treated with your methods and some of the things that I might be able to do to help downregulate their nervous system. But then when we look at chronic illness, and again, I refer people to some of Gabor Mate's recent book, The Myth of Normal, where he goes into very, very deep studies with respect to some of women's health. I really recommend your audience read some of that, because it looks like what we've known for a long time is that women have much higher degrees of autoimmune and immune complex disorders, higher degrees of developing dementia, higher degrees of developing depression, higher degrees of, and all of the complications that come from that. And there's even some linking now in the studies with higher degrees of stress and trauma with things like certain kinds of cancer. We know that there's a very powerful influence on fertility, periods, ovulation, etc., menarche, age of menarche, how people handle and how they're affected by the last part of their menstrual cycle. Do they have PMDD or something such as that? So much of that is stress and trauma based now, and the literature is really replete with all of that. We can now track trauma, its impacts on the nervous system that I was starting to talk about, that get embedded in the brain with a response that's inflammatory, and then a secondary response that's autoimmune, where we actually begin producing our own antibodies against our own tissues. So I'm compressing a tremendous amount of information to try to get to your question, and we can unpack that for hours, literally. But that's the headline. There's many, many illnesses and diseases that are now able to be tracked back, scientifically backed, evidence-based, that connect with trauma.
Yeah, everything that you said just lines up again with things that I've just continued to see. And this is not to downplay that there are actual, digestive issues that need to be addressed. Absolutely.
Of course.
Same thing with hormones, right? There is a lot of hormonal issues that people struggle with that can be regulated through, diet, training, supplementation, prescriptions, all of that. However, the same thing I see with hormones, I see the same parallels here, right? How someone is feeling, physiologically and psychologically, like sometimes can be just due to hormones, but often it can be due to this, these stressors, and not even just the stressors and like trauma, but also the stress perception. And I'd love to get your opinion on this. And I started to see this a few years ago. There's this book, again, if you're a client or you've listened to this, I talk about this book all the time. It's called The Upside of Stress by Dr. Kelly McGonigal out of Stanford. And it really was the first book that kind of opened my eyes to understanding that it's not necessarily stress, it's our stress perception. And again, these are things that I kind of started to piece together from my own life, right? As being someone who's a self-described recovering nihilist, and can be a little bit, I come out of the abyss every once in a while, but also someone who can have these kind of negative, stress perception. And I started to recognize that my clients who were struggling the most with gut issues and hormonal dysregulation were the clients who had negative stress perception. And again, these are things that you can't just work through right away, but having that awareness really is that first step. So would you see that have you seen that as well, that a lot of times it's not even just the past trauma, that it's also like the acute, how someone continues to respond? Or I guess that might be a byproduct of the trauma, and that's just kind of how you're now responding, and that's like your default setting.
So, okay, again, write a book on what you just said. So let's separate two things out. Let's separate it in an acute stress response, right? So what happens in an acute or acute on chronic stress response? You have an upregulation of your autonomic nervous system. You have an upregulation of your sympathetic nervous system. You have an upregulation of the of cortisol, and I do just about for every patient now. I track their cortisol for 24 hours of cortisol, and I match that to their neurotransmitters, and we get a very, very good picture of what's happening with their neurotransmitter metabolites and their cortisol. And whenever you have a real discrepancy in that HPA axis, you're going to have multiple manifestations of it. So back to your
What
point.
method do you use to track that? Sorry, I'm just curious before I forget.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So for many women that I'm following hormones on, I use Dutch, and the Dutch
okay.
test and its different variations will do that 24-hour
Okay.
cortisol. However, that the Dutch is not as specific as something like the ZRT. The
Yep.
ZRT is much better at being able to show more precisely what's
Okay.
happening.
Yeah.
But when you have cortisol that's so dysregulated, you have to dysregulate the rest of your hormonal system. So what I'm seeing is disruptions in growth hormone. I'm seeing increases in inflammatory markers. I'm seeing disruptions in the pituitary functioning, where the pituitary is putting out LH, FSH in a cyclical, normal, healthy way. Why? Because you're going to have all of these interferences with stress and the stress byproducts that are produced physiologically with the ability of that HPG axis to properly function. So what happens? Estrogen and progesterone balance gets knocked off. Testosterone in women can be severely depleted. Same thing in men, obviously. But testosterone is an underappreciated hormone in women and should be looked at more carefully, in my opinion. But then you start to see, when progesterone gets knocked off, you're smiling.
Oh, that's a whole different conversation. The clinics now with people, and I'm not against HRT or any kind of hormones whatsoever, but it is very scary what is happening there, because I think people are recognizing the point that you shared, which is it's important, but people are not regulating enough, right? Where I've had clients come back and they're, female clients, their test is 1, 2, 300. I mean, like it's out of control, and it's like, I understand that there's a process of we gotta, figure this out and it takes time, but it's just like the negligence, in my opinion, get my tinfoil hat on, but I'm like, are you just creating problems so that now you keep these clients? But
Well, the answer
anyways.
is yes, unfortunately. There's too many
Yeah.
bad actors, because once they see something, and this is uh, partly the internet, partly what we're seeing with nefarious physicians that are trying to monetize things that they know absolutely nothing about. Your testosterone is low. Oh, let's put in some pellets and you're going to come back with a 300. I mean, that's just completely irresponsible malpractice. And I'm so against the extremes that people use in order to monetize these things. And they use scare tactics. They use all kinds of other things. Yeah, we can make somebody feel better, but whenever you're improving performance like above a certain baseline, you're also really doing a lot of harm underneath by these stupid hacks and they're financially viable. So that's an extreme that's just really unfortunate.
Yes.
So I think the broader point, though, is that whenever we look at stress, we have to be aware of the multiple manifestations of it and how it interferes with normal, healthy functioning, how it interferes with allostatic balance, how it interferes with how the rest of us are functioning. Now, the other question that you're bringing up, which is also so salient, is how does trauma impact that? Let's walk that back a little bit, because I think this is partly what Kelly's talking about, but maybe I'm not exactly 100% on this. But if we talk about a traumatic event, it's not just the event itself. Like, you can be in a car accident, and you can have multiple things happen within that car accident. Maybe the airbag goes off, maybe you're protected, maybe it's very scary and very frightening, but nothing happens internally, right? So what I consider trauma to be is not the actual accident itself, as bad and as horrific as that may be, but the impact internally. What injury, what wound, what has it created? Where has, metaphorically, the bleeding occurred? Where has the injury occurred? It's the injury inside the trauma that then has to get scarred around and then adapted to, maladapted to quite frequently, sometimes positively adapted to, though.
Mhm.
And that injury and the injuries that come about from the trauma have a direct correlation with that stress response later on.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's kind of like it's almost fueling your like the past experiences are fueling how you presently react, right? And that is creating further adaptations, and it's almost it becomes this almost for lack of a better term, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like you have now, like this happened to you in the past, and like now you continue to create and recreate this because of your thoughts. And this is something that I've been diving into so heavily, again, just for my own self, and then sharing this with clients. And it's really remarkable how we literally can change how much we feel just by like our thoughts, you know what I mean? And it really is everything, like our intentionality and our focus and like where we put our energy and attention. It's actually it's kind of eerie, you know, like when like you can see it like so quickly like reflected back to you, like, oh my gosh, like I continue to focus on that, like again, positive or negative, and these things actually manifested and happened and were reflected back to me, whether that was an experience or from another individual. And this is something that I've been examining a lot for myself, like, wow, okay, this person was a reflection of what I have always been scared of, but I created that because of how I
Mhm.
was acting, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, like it's real. I am the problem. Like, oh my gosh, it really is. Like, it's me. And I think that we, you know, obviously, like, there, when we're talking about, especially not just ourselves, but other individuals and interactions, like, there is another person involved, right? And we can't discount how they're acting, but we can only control us and ourselves. And really, like, there are so many things that we create um just from our own thoughts. And I guess that kind of goes into that almost like self-sabotage idea, which I know in the world of psychology and psychiatry can be debated. You know, some people are like, no, that's not a thing, and other people really ride that. So just kind of curious, what do you think about that? If I were to say the term self-sabotage, what how do you feel about that?
I want to go back to something you just said first, and
Yeah.
then move on from there, because when we take responsibility for something, it's so freeing. Now, there's two ways that we can take responsibility, right? We can take responsibility and beat ourselves up, and we feel bad about ourselves, and we attack ourselves, and become self-critical, and we develop this whole narrative of our quote badness, right? On the other hand, if we take responsibility and say, oh no, I helped to create this situation with this person, I'm even helping to create this mood within myself, or maybe even the mood in the other person. You take personal responsibility leads to freedom,
Mhm.
because that leads to your being able to make the change. If you put yourself and put the responsibility on somewhere else, if you crawl into a hole of self-pity, if you do other things like that, then you're doing the opposite.
Never. Who does that?
You're right. So it's very, first of all, it's very, very empowering to be able to do what you just described. Now, on taking your next thought along the line, self-sabotage. Okay, I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit neurologically, if you don't mind, for a second.
Perfect.
So there's some really interesting research that's gone on in the last 5 years. The unconscious used to be thought of as some Freudian woo-woo thing where people didn't really pay attention to it and so forth, until the cognitive psychologists got in and started really measuring it. And yes, you can measure the functioning and the speed even of our unconscious brain. So I'll liken it to a processing system in a computer. We're able to process up to 40 million bits of information per second in our unconscious brain. Think about that number. And that includes, sensory, it includes emotional, it includes bringing memories in, it includes information that we are just not consciously aware of, but that's how fast that unconscious processing system is. Consciously, we're able to process at the very most four bits of information per second.
That was so underwhelming. Four.
Yes. And then when you introduce bias into that, confirmatory bias and that sort of thing, well, that four shrinks to one or two, because then we want to shrink everything down to make it more understanding or more understandable, right? So we're really just telling ourselves stories about what's going on in our brain. We're playing catch up, telling ourselves stories, and trying to catch all of these other things that are going on until we find more methods to be able to access that. But that's the life that we're living. And we're living these sort of storytelling lives. And again, I know we're bringing up social media a lot, but that's how the influence creeps in.
We
It
bring
tells
it up a
the
lot
story.
because it's that important. Like it's not that like, like it's it's actually it's I talk about this all the time and I think about this entirely too much. It's honestly very scary to think about how much this has changed everybody's lives.
Hmm.
And I mean, obviously, I guess the one solution is to just completely wipe it away, like take it away, but that's never going to happen, right? So it's kind of like there's really no point in thinking that way. Obviously, there's some people who opt to not live in this kind of a way, but that's a very small minority of people. And it really is just like, I don't even know how we're going to be able to measure the impacts of this type of thing and how it literally is going to change society, that has changed society forever, and how it's going to continue to change things. Like, I don't know where that's gonna go, is like the world just gonna split, like, all right, if you're in this camp, you're gonna live over here. You live over here, you're like, right, like, are we just like, it's a very interesting thing to think about, and it is so prolific, which is why bring it up as much as you want, because those effects cannot be talked about enough. Like, I don't think people really recognize the behaviors that it creates, not only just the information that's transmitted, but the compulsive behaviors that it creates. Like, I've done two sabbaticals, I call them, where because my business is largely online, right? And well, my whole business is online, and then I create social media content, like, which is the hilarious thing. But I'm like, I hate this. But I'll take these month-long breaks where I completely delete Instagram off of my phone, and within the first 24 hours, I mean, I must grab my phone uh, unconsciously. I mean, and it's the first time I did it, I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is this is such a compulsion." It's not as much of an addiction. I think a lot of people deem it as an addiction. I find it's more of a compulsion, right, for a lot of people. And it's "Oh, I'm uncomfortable right now. Let me grab something."
Hmm.
Um, "Oh, I don't want to deal with this right now. I'll just self-soothe," which is not soothing at all, but I need to distract myself from this lonely feeling or dealing with this emotion. And it's very, very crazy when you actually take it out of your life to realize how much it does affect things. So you can talk about social media as much as you want because it is so valid how it is changing everything. Sorry, I totally derailed us. That's that's so
Uh,
much for you.
no, not at all. Because I think if we bring this back to mental health and
Hmm.
physical health, what's really pushing social media is monetization and popularity.
Hmm.
So people will take specific, this is where it gets really dangerous. People will take specific, call them hacks. I mean, hacks, interventions, whatever, and say, oh, the keto diet, that's all you need to do and everything's going to be fine. Oh, just do breath work and everything's going to be great. And okay, then you have, X tens of thousands of breathwork followers because you're the breathwork expert, or you have tens of thousands of keto followers because you're the keto expert. We can go on and on. But these are only very, very, very tiny things that influence an entire organism, an entire system, an entire self. And it may not be the right thing for you, but because it's made to look alluring, you
Hmm.
you sort of connect with it, right?
Hmm.
Oh, and then there's how many people want a shortcut? How many people want a quick answer? How many people want something simple? Most of us, in some way, if we're
Yeah.
given some simple answer, we're going to jump
Hmm.
at it. But that all feeds that whole social media monster.
Hmm.
So we're feeding these people that are providing these kinds of contents without being able, it's very dehumanizing. We stop being able to look internal. We stop being able to find our true stories, our true self, our authenticity, our essence. All of that gets lost.
Hmm.
And the
Yeah.
further this goes down the line, the more distant we get from ourselves, the more alienated we get from ourselves. So, what looks like what started off as a method of connecting and communicating is actually a method of self isolation.
Oh yeah, I would, the stuff that's come out about like the loneliness, just in general, like that is such a prolific issue now, and that, part of it is just kind of the way that, our worlds are set up, but this digital the digitalization, that's not a word, of everything has certainly not helped either. But coming back to the self-sabotage thing, 'cause I know I was the one who derailed us. So in terms of self-sabotage, would you say that that's something that you find that a lot of people who maybe have had more trauma or had these more kind of, this negative stress perception or this high amount of stress in their life that they create? Or how would you see that that kind of shows up in people's lives? Or would you just completely disagree with that kind of phrasing, I guess?
That's part of why I began to talk about the fast brain and the slow
Hmm.
brain. Self-sabotage almost exclusively occurs beyond our conscious awareness. So
Hmm.
for those that have a problem with the term, they're only thinking about some kind of deliberate and conscious self-sabotage, which is not very often. I mean, that's very, very rare. I don't know that I've seen that a half dozen times in my career, but for the most part, we repeat patterns unknowingly, unwittingly, and unconsciously, in which we're ending up hurting ourselves.
Hmm.
So, in terms of a broad definition, yes, that happens all the time. We end up in the same rut, the same place, and then we end up saying, "Oh my God, I'm in the same place again. How did I get here?" This could be a relationship, it could be an ailment, it could be an injury, it could be some kind of whatever the case may be. How did I end up here again? Well, what ended up happening is you're unconsciously repeating emotions, thoughts, behaviors, and so forth that have been there probably for the longest time possible, maybe farther back than you can even remember where the roots of this started, and then developed over time. And that's how I'd probably kind of narrow that definition down.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. And I like how you phrase that in terms of it is this unconscious behavior for the most part. Obviously I'm sure there's an example where it's not, but I would agree that's probably why people discount it, because they're thinking of these very like overt situations that just aren't really happening a lot. But when we get a little bit deeper, that makes a lot more sense. So we've talked a lot about, trauma and just kind of maybe how it manifests differently. But what are some ways that you would kind of start to work through this, right? Obviously, the first step is awareness, right? People need to be aware, have the awareness that, they're repeating these patterns or that maybe something's happened and they need to address it. But like once somebody has gotten that level of awareness, like what are some of the things that you would maybe recommend, or that you would start to do in your practice, to work through that?
So, first of all, always starting with the now, always starting with the moment that we're in. So, if we continue with the thought that we had before about here I go again, or I'm stuck in something, or I can't quite get there, or whatever that may be, uh, the first thing I would bring to that is awareness. B, well, there's actually even a preliminary step, predictability. Predict that if it's happened so many times, predict it's going to happen again. And it's okay that it happens again because we're not in control of it happening again. But the predictability allows us to bring awareness into that moment. Okay, so what does awareness mean? It means being aware of what are our thoughts? What are we feeling? What are our body sensations? And this is a very, very big thing that I took out of athletics and working with very high level athletes. We live in our bodies. What are our bodies telling us? So that it's physical self-awareness. It isn't just this concept of mindfulness, like what are we thinking? It's what are we feeling from top to bottom? And if we can become aware of what that is in that particular moment, say it's we're about to face a hard decision, and if we find ourselves ramping up, that means that our amygdala and our limbic system has kind of taken over the decision-making process. And it's going to become an automatic response then. We don't want that. We want to be able to make changes if we're going to get unstuck. So we bring this body brain awareness into it, and then we find methods that you teach very, very well about settling our nervous system, doing some breath work, taking a knee proverbially that I say with my NFL players, just taking a break. And that could be something so simple in an office setting as going in and splashing cold water on your face. Anything that just breaks that pattern of upregulation. That allows us to be able to bring our frontal lobes back into being able to be useful to us. So it calms our nervous system down. We can begin to think our way through. Okay, so that's what we do in the particular moment, Lauren, with these sorts of things that I find most helpful. And then we've got all these other practices along the way that we've talked about with the meditation, the tanks, the hot, the cold, the sunlight, and all of those other things that can just kind of bring things down in general.
Mhm.
And then we get into the deeper parts of this. We get into how do we show up and become most authentic? How are we defining authenticity? Because so many of our layers of adaptation, we're actually burying what our true selves really are. And there's one thing that's, as we were smiling about ahead of time, we were talking about there's one way you can learn about yourself, but there's only one way in to learn yourself. So understanding and being aware, and then following that, being able to be authentic. The next one is, in my opinion, and this is one that may surprise some people, is anger. So much of suppressed anger, especially the way women are conditioned. And that's another, I'm talking about as little girls, to not show your anger, to not be angry. So much of suppressed anger shows up in illness later on.
Mm.
But anger is the definitive expression of being able to say no with force at that moment. So
Mm.
being able to bring that into whatever is going on, and then that could mean, no, I'm not going to go there. No, I'm not going to have that drink. No, I'm not going to go and do something I don't really want to do to please somebody. But there has to be a hard no that you bring into your repertoire. However, the path to doing that, the path to healing, is really different for everybody. I never sort of provide a sort of a one size fits all,
Yeah.
because there is no one size, and there is no one person that we can that's a facsimile
No.
for everybody else, right? So,
Everyone's favorite answer. It depends.
well, you know what? I liken this a little bit to natural childbirth, so stay with me for a minute, because natural childbirth has to unfold on its own.
Mhm. Mhm.
The same way that becoming aware of ourselves and finding out who we are
Mm.
has to be our own journey, and we have to go in and we have to go back.
Wow. I gave you the Florida analogy. Now I like that analogy. So we just swapped analogies. That is
We're
so true though, because I mean, think about how many times, like if someone is, you know, we can see on the outside, like this person should make a change, not even like for our own benefit, but like, man, like it would be so great if they would be able
Yeah,
to change. It's so obvious to us. And even for ourselves, like maybe we know, kind of intuitively, all right, maybe I should be making some changes. But until you've decided to make that change, it's not going to happen. You know what I mean? Like the individual has to decide, like, all right, I'm gonna go within and I have to be the one who is ready to make this change. Like you can't force anybody to do that, because they might try, okay, I'll go to a few therapy sessions, or I'll try this breath work, or I'll do it, I'll start eating healthier for a few weeks, like it's like all of that. But if they're not doing it because they want to make that change, it's really, really hard to
but
make any long-term kind of substantial difference.
critical point in this conversation, because without commitment, there's no progress in anything. And I think most people want to get better, but then people have blocks internally. And this may be part of the loop back to the self-sabotage part too, because how many people are actually going to follow through with, say, a New Year's resolution, right? I mean, we're blocked to committing to ourselves, but those blocks are largely unconscious. And that's what we have to get to. Because if we know what to do, if we know what's going to make us feel better, if we know what's going to make us more successful, whether it's in relationships and intimacy and loving or work or whatever the case may be, even our own personal fitness, we have to be committed to that. But in order to be committed to that, we have to sweep away the blocks that are blocking our commitment.
Mhm. Absolutely, which is certainly the part that takes time, which is why, a lot of the people that I work with, and I'm sure you too have been, self-described chronic dieters, and it's, I've tried this and I've tried that, and obviously there are undeniable metabolic and hormonal adaptations that are happening that do compound over time, that make fat loss and achieving a body and health composition that you like, much more challenging. But I do think that a lot of it comes down to this really like embodiment of this commitment of like, no, like I no longer want to be this type of person. That goes back to, I guess, kind of the beginning. Like, I don't want to, like, this is who the type of person that I want to be. Right. And like creating that new identity in this positive sense, you know what I mean? Like, this is the type of person that like I want to be. And like, I am this kind of person. So I make these kind of decisions. And that is how people are actually going to be able to sustain that change. So I know you know, have an amazing practice. Just kind of walk us through a few options that you've seen, especially in the realm of trauma, that would make, again, general, right? Everybody's going to be different, but generally what you find to be the most beneficial, I guess, for a large majority of people, kind of in this space.
Well, I think this is where some of our work is complementary because I too believe in the foundational aspects of things. So, whenever anybody comes in that's a new patient, I look at all of their labs. For example, I look at all of their physiology, I look at their blood labs, I look at their neurotransmitters, look at their 24-hour cortisol, and then we develop practices that are very foundational, that are very sort of coaching based practices
Mhm.
to get people to get people healthier, because once people are able to become healthier, then they have an increased resilience of dealing with the tough stuff to come.
Mhm.
So that's kind of a very solid foundational place to start. But at the same time, I feel that people really are hungry for connection, don't know how to find real connection. And as we were talking about, it needs to be a safe connection. So they need trust, they need safety, they need to feel like I'm really present with them and I really care, because that's why I do this work, and that's why I mean I really do care, and it's something that I put heart and soul into, and but without that you can't face the really tough stuff that goes on inside. So that's how I start to sort of build the relationship, and then I begin to think about putting myself as much in the moment with the patient as I potentially can. And this is after, okay, so the other one is maybe in the meantime, as we're doing that work, we've also found some things that we can correct in their physiology. So we're doing
Mhm.
that part. I'm not anti-pharmacology, but I'm certainly not pro-pharmacology. Sometimes a medication is needed, but only as sort of an adjunct. I say it's a sprinkling of seasoning at times of a medication, has helped a lot of people. But as so that part is going on, but I'm working directly in a very different realm with somebody else. The next part I open up with them is the idea of compassionate inquiry. So many people get angry at themselves, upset with themselves, put themselves down. A critical, and particularly with trauma, we always want to blame ourselves because, hey, we can't blame the people that we rely on and depend on to survive, right? So the natural fallback is to say, oh, it must be my fault. And it must be I must have done something. And people carry that with them. So instead of being self-critical, can we open up a way to say, okay, how can I, if I make a mistake, if I say something dumb, if I make a faux pas socially, if I do something that where if I relapse with a drug or something of that sort, can I back off and say, hmm, that's really sad. Why did I do that? And begin to examine ourselves from a compassionate space rather than a judgmental space. And once you begin to layer these things onto into daily life, then different things will begin to happen. I also really recommend, I know this is over talked about, but journaling and getting your thoughts down at the end of the day in a way, pen and paper, not computer, because the physicality of the pen and paper actually transmits more of your emotions through your hands
Mhm.
than it does through a keyboard. So, and you begin to see patterns in all of that as they come up, and then people will bring them in and talk about them with me. And then, as we were talking about before, I'm beginning to use ketamine a fair amount
Mhm.
too, in order to begin to access that 40 million bits of information per second in a much quicker way, and be able to open up on things that have been buried, that are unconscious, and so forth. So I use that a lot now with trauma with patients.
Mhm.
I find that extraordinarily helpful. So the idea is to create kind of a narrative in a context, in a nest of acceptance and trust. They begin to understand our well, we begin to understand ourselves and be able to understand and become much more aware. We're kind of opening up spaces of enlightenment into ourselves as to why we're doing what we're doing. That then goes back to that idea of empowerment. We become more empowered and in control in our lives. So, I mean, there's much, much more that goes into this, but I would say that in general principles, that's kind of speaks maybe to your question.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really great breakdown because there's some things that, like you said, it can start from the present moment, what you're doing in that exact moment, to practices you can do on a daily basis, like journaling, to then obviously the physiology and the behaviors, and then maybe some pharmaceuticals involved, and potentially something like a ketamine assisted therapy and all that, but all coming from that place of like acceptance and understanding and really trying to figure out what to do moving forward. And I think that that's so great. And we could definitely feel like we need a part two for so many other things because this was so incredible. And I appreciate your time so much. And I know everybody listening certainly will as well. So, is there a space or a place that you would recommend directing people for either information that you've put out or your services? Plug and share away.
I don't do much on Instagram because of the reasons we're talking about.
I get it.
So, however, I like to blog. There's a lot on my website, the Miletic Center. I've got a bunch of podcasts out there as well. And if people want to contact me, feel free through the website. And I'm actually happy to have either myself or a staff member, if I'm busy, answer your questions within 24 hours and get back to you. I like to be very forward facing and very interactive with the people I'm meeting. So I'm pretty easy to get to.
Well, I appreciate your time and attention so much. And I know everybody got so much out of this. So please, if you guys listening enjoyed the show, share it. That is how we get our message across. For any other inquiries about coaching or information that we have, you can visit teamlogofit.com. And I will certainly put your information in the show notes as well so people can easily access that. So once again, thank you so much for coming on. And everybody listening, share the show and hope you have a great rest of your week.